Blast off.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first Schools Forum of the year, unbelievably. Andy, I know we've had some apologies for this meeting. Do you want to go through them for me, please?
Yeah, morning. Heather Davis from The Bridge, Penny Hustwick from ABC Nurseries, Laura Oscott from Telford College, Joe Britton, Director of Children's Services, Natalie Bevan, SDM for Send, and Rachel Cook from Newdale.
Okay, so that's quite a few, isn't it? Right.
Claire Whiting has also said she's going to be a wee bit late, but she will be getting in as soon as she can.
Thank you. Right, welcome everybody then, and particular welcome to Shirley. Nice to see you, Shirley, on the call.
Thank you very much, Jill. Much appreciated.
Okay, so I think I now don't do anything and I hand over to Tim.
Right. Well, this is the first meeting of the school year, as Jill has just said. So one of the things we do at the start of each school year form is elect a chairperson. So in time-honoured fashion, would anyone like to nominate themselves or indeed anyone else?
I'd be happy to nominate Jill.
I'd like to second that nomination for Jill.
Anyone else like to put themselves forward?
I'm more than happy for Jill.
Didn't think I'd be trampled in the rush for this one. So, okay. Well, I think, Jill, if you're happy to continue.
Yep, very happy.
The form are more than happy for you to continue.
Yeah, as long as nobody else is desperate to do it, I'm happy to continue. And thank you very much for your confidence. So we'll move on to membership of Schools Forum. Is that Andy or you, Tim?
I think I'll pass over to Andy on this one. Just describe where we've got to, because there's been one or two changes.
Yeah, in accordance with the regulations, the schools members have got to be in proportion to the number of pupils in that type of setting. So we've had a review and we've reduced the primary school membership to 6.
This is maintained schools, just to make the distinction. So, sorry to interrupt, Andy, but when he's talking about the sort of types of school, the main distinction we have to bear in mind is between academies and maintained schools. So the rules are that the membership of the forum for those groups has to be broadly in proportion to people numbers. Obviously, it's very difficult to get it exactly broadly proportion to people numbers. So we've obviously had some conversions over the years. You know, they tend to sort of drip in, but gradually it does sort of change the balance between the two sectors. Do you want to pick it up from there, Andy? Sorry to
yeah. No, that's fine. So effectively, we're now having 6 primary school members, 1 secondary school member, and 5 academy members. And looking at the membership, we are awaiting a governor member in the primary sector. We're awaiting a secondary school member, and we're still waiting for a member from Kickstart Academy.
Yeah.
So we effectively got 3 vacancies. All the primaries are full. All the academies are full.
Okay, excellent. So I said I'd talk to Tom from Kickstart about joining, so be good for him. So I think he'll do that for us. So if we can confirm that, and then you haven't heard back from the 2 secondary heads yet, then?
I've heard back from one of the 2 schools, although
Okay.
they would struggle to have a representative this term, but they could probably do it from next term. I haven't heard back from the other school, so I'll chase them and see where we get to. For the governor member, we have, I think it's termly sort of chairs meetings with governors, and I was going to see if we could see if there's any interest from a member at that meeting, which I think is coming up quite soon. So the process of in train to fill the vacant post, we just haven't quite got there yet.
Tim, I can also help in terms of the governor member by going to the governing service. So
yeah, that would be good.
I'll do that as well. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Because they've just had the chairs. And
we had it last Thursday.
Okay.
Yeah.
You missed the boat there, Tim.
We can get it out another way. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That'd be good. And if we're really struggling with a primary governor, then maybe put it through Primary Heads Forum or something, Simon.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, yep. We could also actually, I'm just thinking now, top of my head, put something in the notice board just to make sure
Yeah.
that people are aware,
Mm.
because maybe we need to raise the profile of School Forum a little bit more. So let's think about that as well as an action. Okay.
Maybe put out who's on School
Yeah,
Forum.
I think
So
just a
people know
very
who the
quick.
reps are. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I agree. I think a very quick kind of briefing about School Forum, just to refresh people's memory that we're all still here. Yeah, that'd be a good idea.
And we can put a link to the site so anyone who wants to have a look can then see everything that's there as well.
Yeah. Okay. Tim and I put something together and we share it with you, Jill, and then we put it on the notice board. Yeah.
Excellent. Good. Yeah, I think we do need to promote a bit, and there's obviously new heads as well. You know.
Yes.
Who won't be aware necessarily of the work of the forum.
Yeah.
Okay. Lovely. Thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to minutes of our last meeting, which was unbelievably on the 20th of May. So we've had a look at these, I think. And has anybody got anything in terms of accuracy in the minutes that they want to raise? No. And has anybody got any matters arising from the minutes? Again, we had a look at these last week, and I think most of the things that were touched on will come up in this meeting. We felt we dealt with the whole early years issue, and that went out on the notice board. And I think the view we took last week is if there are other issues around early years, then they need to address them directly to the early years team. I don't know your thoughts on that, Simon?
Yeah, I would agree. I think we have established an early year steering group, so I'm hoping that can pick up the ongoing discussions. So I don't feel, I mean, the problem we've got just at the moment is, I guess it would be helpful to have Claire just to get a sense. But I feel that we've achieved what we wanted to, which was to describe the early years team in a bit more detail for colleagues. So kind of tick the box for School Forum, and it's going to be picked up at that network meeting. Yeah.
Okay, I don't know if any primary heads got any comments. Okay, I'll take that as we're okay on this issue. And then the end of the meeting, we looked at sort of the meeting organisation and light of COVID and how meetings will operate in the future. So I think we're going to look at a balance of teams and face-to-face, and face-to-face meetings will be perhaps when they're in November, when we're looking at budget setting and big picture stuff. When we feel we want a really good conversation with forum. If it's like today, fairly straightforward business, we'll stick to teams. So sort of conscious of people's times, and it seems to work well on teams. So we'll continue, but obviously keep it under review. And anything else from you, Tim, on matters arising?
I don't think so. As you say, Jill, we'll pick up one or two things in this meeting. So we've got some draft allocations for next year, for example, high needs in other areas. So we'll talk about that in a minute.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move swiftly on to item 4, school funding. Always exciting, 2021-22. Oh, sorry, Andy.
Can I just remind members that under the regulation, because it's a virtual meeting, all members have got to have the camera switched on and the microphone switched on. I know the microphone's a bit of a pain, but because to meet the regulations, it has to be that way. Sorry.
So we need to see all your lovely faces if we can, please. Thank you. Thanks, Andy. I wasn't totally aware of that regulation. Okay, so Tim, over to you. There's a paper been sent out. So if you'd like to take us through the paper, please.
Just to follow on from what Andy's just said, in the sort of other circumstance, I would share this so you could see it on screen, but then that obviously minimises the your sort of the visuals for you. So unfortunately, not really meant to do that either. So I'll take you through the paper, but obviously if you have got 2 screens or you've printed it off, it might be useful if you've got it in front of you. But as I say, bearing in mind this, I will go through in perhaps a bit more detail than I would do if I knew they'd all got it in front of you anyway. Okay, so it's School Funding 22-23 is the paper, and it sort of condenses what the government has released. I think it was in July it came out, about 22-23 and a bit about the future years after that. So just as a recap, We're in the second year now of the 3-year settlement the government announced a couple of years ago. So 22-23 will therefore be the last year of that settlement, the 3-year settlement. When they announced it, they announced a sort of a series of increases year on year, and that will happen next year. So that's been delivered. So as a result of that, in terms of mainstream school funding, the key factors in their formula, the DFE's formula to get money to us, will increase by 3%. And I think 4 members will be aware for the last few years, we've agreed that we'll try to mirror the DFE's formula at a local level as far as possible. So basically whatever they do, broadly speaking, is what will happen to your budgets as well. There is a bit of a caveat there though, which is these days we get the main block of money for mainstream schools, part of the formula, then we get a separate formula which gives us some money for growth. So the DFE is a way of dividing each authority into these mini areas, looking at growth within each of these mini areas, then allocating funds based on that. Now, the last few years, that's been broadly in line, I think, with what we've then allocated to schools for growth. And just to remind for this is mainly in Telford at the moment in the secondary sector. So we have some secondary schools with pretty substantial growth, and therefore it would be difficult for those schools to deal with the normal lag in funding. This is why we allocate growth funding. But there is always a chance that we get, let's say, £1 million from the DFE, but we've agreed to fund growth that costs us 1.3 million, let's say. So the £300,000 difference would then be taken from the main schools block and therefore depress the amount of money for all schools generally. Now, given the scale of the schools block, which is about 130 million, Andy, something like that. It's going to be a sort
136,
of,
I guess.
yeah, it's going to be a fairly sort of small impact on the overall pot, but just to be aware, if we don't simply pass on the full amount that we've got, it's probably going to be around that sort of reason. But with that caveat, going back to what I say, broadly speaking, we will aim to mirror what the DFE has done in their form to get the money to us. So as well as a 3% increase in the key factors, there's also a concept now in the formula which affects a fair number of our schools in Telford, probably, again, Andy, 15 to 20 schools around a minimum funding level, something like that. So this is a floor the government's put in the last couple of years, and it says no matter what school you are, you must get this amount of minimum funding per pupil. Now, the impact of this tends to be that schools that have relatively low levels of deprivation and low power attainment tend to be topped up back to the minimum funding level. They did a couple of years of increasing this, which brought more schools in Telford onto it, and they've now sort of just increased it by 2%, so that it's now sort of stabilised. So it will be next year 4,265 for primary schools, 5,525 for secondary schools. And say for some schools it's pretty significant, 6-figure sums for some schools from this element. Apart from that, the structure of the formula is very similar to the previous year from the DFE side. There is one change which I think will affect a grand total of one Telford school probably, but they have changed the way they do sparsity. So sparsity is allocating more money to schools that are rural, and used to measure rurality by a straight line measure between is this between the next school, Andy, the measure they use? Yeah. So they used to take the distance between a school and the next school, and if it exceeded a certain number of miles, then the school was counted as rural and therefore could potentially get sparsity funding. It used to be just a straight sort of cliff edge. So if you're above the threshold of 2 or 3 miles, you got something. If you're slightly below, you got nothing at all. They've now introduced a taper. So for primary schools, the taper is between 1.6 and 2 miles. For secondary, 2.4 and 3 miles. So if you're above those levels, you can get a bit of funding up to the sort of the maximum level if you hit the 2 or 3 mile mark. So it's a combination of that and being small, that's measured by cohort size. So for Telford, the impact is one more of our schools qualifies for sparsity funding. That's the impact. I think is it 3 schools now getting, Andy? Something like
4.
That? 4. Okay. So because we're mainly, as you know, the layout of Telford is we have the main urban core, then we have Newport, and then we have a sort of a rural sort of chunk. So it's the schools in that rural chunk that's potentially get some sparsity funding. Just the background to this, clearly we've had a couple of disrupted years in schools, so we haven't got the same data we'd normally have. So the DfE have used 2019 assessment data as a proxy for the prior attainment data they'd normally use for 2020 and 2021. Eligibility data for FMS6, this is the EVER6 measure of deprivation. They've changed the base in which the date in which it's going to take that from. So it's going to be now from the October 2020 census, which is still quite a long way behind, but is slightly more up to date than the previous measure. We don't know yet about the amount of growth funding because they actually look at the October census before that's allocated. So we await the results of the census. And he has contacted schools to ask if we can have a sort of a prior view of the numbers in schools, because we don't get the DfE data until November, December, Andy, something like that.
Second week in December.
Second week in December, so it's quite late in the term. So although we can't do official budgets, if we've got some numbers from schools now, it gives us some sort of an idea of things like growth and how much that is going to impact. So that's for next year. So just as a reminder of the form, the actual formal approval of what we do with the school funding form isn't a form decision. That's a council decision. So it gets taken to Cabinet each year. But Cabinet obviously will have heed to what the forum think. So they will always ask, what does the forum view on this? But unless anyone's got any objections, our plan is to continue on as we have in the last few years and mirror the national funding form as close as we can. And when it comes to the next part of the paper, we'll sort of see the point of this, because the government is now talking about moving the whole system to a direct funding of schools from the centre at school level, which is sort of what we've been preparing for locally. So the sort of second part of the DfE sort of information is about what they're going to do after 22-23. So you, I think, are aware, as I said, that the DfE's long-term plan was to move away from a situation of having different funding formulas in each local authority to having a single national funding formula. So they've taken us some way towards that by having a formula to give local authorities the money. And the way they've done it means that authorities can mimic it, as we've been doing, because they do it at school level and then combine all the individual school totals to give a block of money to give to LAs. So the plan of the DfE is to largely, or as far as they can, entirely miss out the local authority bit and simply determine funding at school level on a national funding formula. So they're not going to do it in 22-23. So next year will be, broadly speaking, carry on as we are. And they're not going to do it straight away in 23-24. So what they're saying they will do is they'll move towards it by narrowing the scope of what authorities can do to vary the funding formula from 23-24. So it'll gradually get to a point where eventually it disappears and we're on a national funding formula basis. The rationale for that is that the DfE is keen to minimise turbulence in school budgets. So it's a fairly sort of gentle introduction to this. Having set out what they plan to do in broad terms, which is that, though, a lot of the detail has been kicked back to future papers and consultations. So, for example, much of the school funding formula is fairly straightforward now to do at a national level because they've got the national factors. The tricky ones from that point of view are the local ones, such as premises factors. So PFI, joint use, split sites, all those things that depend upon specific local circumstances. So they said they want to bring those into the national funding formula, but the DfE haven't said exactly how they're going to do that. So that's been sort of pushed back to a future consultation. Similarly, there's other issues that the move to a national funding formula would impact upon. Forum members who've been on the forum for a couple of years might recall that for a couple of years, we did ask the forum to move money from the schools block to high needs, so half of 1% of the schools block. So it was around about £600,000, something like that. Now, if you've got a national funding formula at school level, then it obviously begs the question as to how and whether that sort of thing would be allowed. So the DfE haven't actually sort of gone either way with that. They've raised the issue and said there might be need to do something, but they haven't either described what that something would be or said for sure that there will be any opportunity to move funds between blocks. So again, that one has been pushed back to a future consultation. And I've quoted a bit of the document in the paper. The DfE has said future consultations will consider whether a new mechanism in place of the current block transfers and which is consistent with a hard NFF, hard NFF is their term for a school level NFF, needs to be developed for situations in which LAs continue to face significant unavoidable pressures on their high need spending. And obviously the pressure will depend upon how much money the DFE give authorities for high needs. So in a sense, it's all down to the DFE really, and where they go with all of this. And then there's one which obviously affects all you guys, which is the role of schools forum. So with the DFE effectively taking more national control over school funding, things that currently we either consult with you about or you make decisions on are potentially not going to be there anymore. So it takes some powers away from schools forums. So the DFE, and I'll quote again what they say about this: we plan to conduct a wider review of the role of schools forums as we progress with the introduction of the hard NFF and following decisions on the future of the SEND system. This wider review will consider the rules around the membership and structure of schools forums to consider whether these remain appropriate in light of the direct changes as a result of the move to hard NFF and any new responsibilities that schools forums take on. So we'll have to see. As I say, for 22-23, given it's going to be pretty similar, the forum role sort of leading into that year will be pretty similar. But then after that, we'll have to see what the DFE have got to say about it. And obviously this isn't that far away because we consult with you in advance of anything happening. So we sort of will consult with you on 22-23 as we would normally, but we'll probably finish doing that about January. So after that, it depends what the DFE says in terms of what we'll be talking to you about. And then the next one is you'll be aware that at the moment there's four blocks of school funding: schools, high needs, early years, central school services. Central school services came in 3 or 4 years ago with the abolition of the education services grant. So at the moment, again, we come to you and say we've been given 1.1 million. We think the cost of central services schools is going to be this. You vote on that. And then for maintained schools, we then say, in addition, the services we provide just to maintain schools, and then we ask you to agree to de-delegate some funds for that. Again, with the new system brought in, some or all of that might not happen anymore. So they say about the future central school services, this is a quote again for the DFE, our intention is for this consultation to be followed by a more technical consultation on the future central school services covering these issues. So these issues is, for example, whether they get rid of the block for central school services and just give LAs more general funding and say it's just part of your overall pot here. That's one possibility that floats. But again, it's being kicked back to a future consultation. They've also floated the idea, but just as a sort of suggestion, of moving the maintained schools financial year to September to August, as it is now for academies. From a school's point of view, obviously this would make perfect sense. From a local authority point of view, it would mean you'd still be financially part of the local authority, but with a different financial year, which obviously would complicate things in terms of doing closure of accounts, etc. They've invited views, so I suppose they'll mull over those views and see what they think. Right, so in terms of the sort of, if you take a step back and look at the main sort of emphasis on the changes, it's obviously taking, this follows the pattern of the last quite a while really, but it's further reducing the role of the local authority in the school's funding system, and to some extent replacing that by the role of multi-academy trusts. So for example, when the school funding system has a national funding form at school level, quite a lot of this money will flow to multi-academy trusts, and whilst it be allocated on a school by school basis, once it was in the trust, the MAT can then take a decision to move the money around within the trust. And in a sense, you can see that's quite similar to the role LAs used to have or have at the moment, in that a block of money comes into the LA on a formula, but then once it hits the LA, there's some ability to move the money around. So you can sort of see this sort of transition from the system between sort of the DFE at the top and the LA is sort of the intermediary financially to the DFE at the top, and then MAT's taking on some of that intermediary role. From our point of view, there's a little bit of the paper which is easy to ignore but is significant to us, which is the DFE talks about the, in their words, unavoidable legacy payments, those for termination of employment costs and prudential borrowing, some LAs will still be tied into with a separate legacy grant. What they mean by that is that some LAs back in the day, when schools needed to reduce staff, and often this would be done through premature retirements, redundancies, that sort of thing, then they would use dedicated schools grant to pay the cost of that. So in effect, they top slice money from school budgets to pay for these costs. Other authorities, of which we were one, because of the back of the day, we'd be trying to protect school budgets, would pay for those costs through the LA's monies, general fund. So with the change in the funding system, what the DFE has done is said to LAs who've used DSG to pay for this, oh, you've got extra DSG cost, and therefore you wouldn't be able to deliver the national funding formula. So we'll give you some extra money to pay for these costs. So the impact of that is, if you're an LA who used DSG to pay for these costs back in the day, the DFE is now paying those costs for you. If you're an LA like us who paid them out of general fund, we are and will continue to have to pay them out of our general monies. And because it's about £1.3 million a year for Telford, it's not an insignificant sum, particularly if you then top that up over the many years we've been paying it. So it's somewhat galling, to say the least, that the DFE proposed to perpetuate this, what to the Telford Wrekin is clearly very unfair. We'll make sure we say something about that in the consultation, but we said this before to the DFE. I've said it directly to the officials, and they've nodded because they quite get the point, but they don't appear to propose to do anything about it. And I guess it's politics, isn't it? You know, it would be, you know, they get a lot of complaints from authorities who had been used to this money being paid for them. If they then said, oh, you've got to pay them for yourselves. So I understand why the DFE does it, but it does seem obviously very unfair.
Yeah. Can I just stop you there, Tim? And just before we go on to high needs, has anybody got any questions for Tim on that overview of school funding moving forward? And anybody want to raise anything? Okay, just think it's going to be quite an interesting period of time, isn't it? If schools forums are no longer required because of the hard national funding formula, and that it's part of the DFE's centralisation agenda, isn't it? So
I think the now bit of it, the sort of the bit that just says we'll have a national funding form at school level, to me that's the straightforward bit really, because we've got very close to that already. The more knotty bits, all the bits that kicked to the future, which is once you've put a sort of a harder sort of ring fence around the school's blocks, you basically expose in all the other areas to unprotected risk. High needs being the prime example. There's always been this bit of flex in the system, so it's that if one area of the school system is under pressure, you can move some money around to respond to that. So if you're going to take that away and remove, you know, the form ability to decide on that, I do think that's potentially storing up difficulties, which is why the DFE, you know, are sort of hedging the bets a bit at the moment, I think. Yeah,
no, I agree. But I also think the fact that we've had this 3 years where we've known where school funding's going is much more preferable, isn't it? And we'd want to see that mechanism continue, because we've stopped having that, you know, you don't even know what your budget's going to look like until January or whatever, and then, you know, it's fraught with difficulty. So it's good to have had this stability in the 3-year funding.
Very much so, yeah. It was very welcome when the DFE brought that back in, because they'd done that for a while, and they went to annual settlements, which I think was not helpful.
Okay, is there anything to say? I don't know if I can't remember if we pick it up later, Tim, because the only other impact is pay awards, isn't it? And obviously at the moment there's a freeze on teacher pay. We're still waiting to hear final settlement for support staff, but obviously in next year's funding one would expect to see teacher pay rise being fought for by the trade unions. So.
That's right, Jill. And when the DFE do the funding settlements, they tend to refer to, you know, if they refer to it at all, they tend to refer to whether it's real terms or not in terms of general inflation. Yeah. And of course, the school's general inflation is the secondary element, really. That just affects your non-staffing costs. The big deal for schools, what happens to pay awards. And as you say, the for support staff, the local authority offer is 1.75%, which I think the unions are recommending be rejected, but we'll have to see. For teaching staff, there's been a pay freeze. I find it very difficult to believe that'll continue next year, particularly given the current level of inflation. So, you know, from looking at the settlement next year and saying 3% looks okay. Obviously, it would look, you know, from a staffing point of view, obviously you want a pay award, but from a budgeting point of view, the larger the pay award, the more pressure on school budgets. So yes, you can look at what the actual pound sign is going to be at this stage. Until you know what the cost pressures are, it doesn't really give you a full picture of the school budgets next year.
And we are seeing inflation, you know, it's high, isn't it? It's high as it's been for a very long period of time. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Thanks, Tim.
Okay.
Johnson. Anybody got any other issues they'd like to raise?
Just a bit more of the paper then. High needs, as has been the case the last couple of years, quite a significant increase in amount of cash going to the high needs block next year. We don't know the final figure because some of it relies upon the October census, but usually it doesn't move enormously from the initial allocation, and that initial allocation is 2.6 million higher than last year. So again, that's a pretty substantial increase. There are still the existing pressures in high needs which aren't going away anytime soon. Numbers of pupils in special schools, the sort of prevalence of need across all schools, all that I think is still on an upward trajectory. But slightly concerned if I've heard one or two suggestions that the DfE sort of thinks that by the end of this 3-year period, authorities should have sort of sorted out high needs, and therefore the sort of increases we've seen will then come to a bit of an end. Well, you know, the DfE has promised an SEND review for a number of years now, and it still hasn't arrived. At the moment, from a local authority financial point of view, you have potentially uncapped or demand-led cost pressures with a fixed sum of money coming from the DfE, which, as we just talked about with the overall funding system, could become even more fixed. For next year, from a Telford Wrekin point of view, we should be okay financially with high needs, we think. But after that, it does really depend upon what the DfE's plans are for funding high needs and the overall school sort of structure of the school funding system. We'll have to see. Central School Services block is pretty much the same as last year, we think. We've got a small decrease at the moment because we are on a protected sum, so 2.5% comes off each year. Last couple of years, that's more or less been replaced by growth in pupil numbers, and because it's an amount per pupil funding formula, we've tended to lose 2.5% through loss protection and gained a similar sort of figure through pupil growth. So we'll probably end up, I suspect, next year with a fairly similar sum of money. So a bit low in real terms, but nothing too dramatic. And that's about it. So I've just put in the summary that the DfE is going to continue as they've intimated with the final year of the 3-year settlement next year. We'll continue to adhere as close as we can to the national funding formula with sort of caveats around growth, as we've discussed earlier. The DfE's confirmed it wants to move to a hard national funding formula, i.e. one at school level. Some of the issues around that have been kicked back to future consultations. There's a welcome increase again in high needs funding, which will support some things we're doing. Quite a few of those are trying to support mainstream schools, so we have a more resilient system, and we'll talk to you more about that in probably the next form, the form after that. And Central School Services, a pretty similar sum in cash terms. And that's about it.
Thanks, Tim. That's a really useful overview. Thank you. And as always, you know, and there's going to be another huge spending review by the government anyway, isn't there? So we don't know the impact that will have on education. So watch this space, I think, isn't it? Okay. Yeah. Any other comments, questions to Tim on his paper? I'll take that as we can move swiftly on. So we're doing well, guys. We can keep going. So, Tim, you're back on with the National SEN budget paper, please.
Okay. I was going to originally do this, you'll see an agenda with Natalie, but Natalie's not able to be here today. But I think Simon's happy to step into the breach if need be, because obviously this intersects a bit with finance and SEN. I can see Simon's welcoming that prospect.
No problem, Tim. No problem.
So I'm not just going to say, and over to you, Simon, to explain this paper in detail. Right. So notional budgets have been around forever and a day, but certainly locally, I think they've been given a very low profile in the last couple of years, such that it's probably worth just sort of explaining to everyone what we're talking about. which is, we've talked about the blocks of funding. So you get the high needs block funding and you get the main schools block funding. And the notional SEN budget is meant to express the sort of reality that although we have a high needs block, quite a lot of high needs is meant to be funded out of the general schools block funding. So the rationale of the high needs system is that the high needs block of funding per se should only kick in after the first £10,000 of costs have been met by the sort of the mainstream sort of sector. And the way we sort of express how much money is in mainstream school budgets to pay for this is by producing something called the notional SEND budget. So what we basically do is go through the funding formula and decide how much we deem of that funding formula to be high need or SEND. Now, there isn't an awful lot or much at all in terms of national guidance for this. So local authorities tend to form their own views on this, and each local authority has a slightly different way of coming up with the notional SEND budget. And we sort of did our current version a number of years ago. And at the time, what we were trying to do was end up with a similar sum of money with the label of SEND as existed in the previous funding formula. And the result of that, when you look at the sort of the way we've gone about doing it, the percentages, some areas of it look a bit anomalous. It's difficult really to see the rationale behind some of the figures. So with that in mind, and because it was only a notional budget, from a finance point of view, me and Andy have sort of given this a low profile, really. We haven't really gone to a great deal of sort of efforts to sort of highlight this to schools or to explain it to schools and that sort of thing. Partly because we sort of were feeling that it was there was no sort of guidance to say the figure we came up with was the right or wrong figure. The danger with doing that, however, is that it tends to sort of de-emphasize the fact that most of the high needs funding for mainstream schools doesn't come through EHCPs or other specialist funding routes. It's in the budget to start with. So we thought what we'd do is try and sort of relaunch the notional budgets for 22-23, and as part of that, do a sort of revised method of calculating them, which is a bit more transparent and hopefully a bit more consistent. So this is what we want to sort of talk to you about today. So section 2 of the paper talks about the existing notional budget model in Telford Wrekin. So at the moment, we deem in the model that just under 9.6% of primary mainstream school budgets is for SEND, and 11.24% of secondary budgets is for SEND. So a higher percentage of secondary budgets compared to primary budgets. And we come to those figures by taking amounts of some of the main funding factors. So in primary schools, we take 2.1% of the ORPU, 34.5% of deprivation, 34% of low power attainment, 50% of English as an additional language, or EAL, 2.1% of the lump sum. Secondary schools, 2.2% of ORPU, 34.5% of deprivation, 82.5% of low power attainment, 50% of EAL, 2.2% of the lump sum. Now, if you look at those figures side by side, as I've got in the paper, one or two of those things would strike you as being slightly odd, such as why is it 2.2% of the ORPU for secondaries and 2.1% for primaries? Why is it 82.5% of low power attainment for secondaries and 34% for primaries? And for lump sum again, why is it a smidge higher for secondaries at 2.2 compared to 2.1? And the answer is that we were trying to get to the previous figures in the funding formula. So there wasn't really any rationale any greater than that. Now, when we did the original funding formula, which had been many years ago, no doubt there was a rationale, there was some thought went into it. But having looked, neither me nor Andy were actually able to find out what that rationale was. So you end up with a system which has these slightly odd percentages which are either slightly different between the sectors for reasons sort of which we don't really know, or in the case of one of the factors, which is low power attainment, quite dramatically different. So in the absence, say, of national guidance, and because we couldn't really describe rationally why we've got the current figures we've got, we thought what we'd do is look at what other LAs do and then sort of look at the average of what other LAs do across the country. Now, I should emphasise, just because it's an average doesn't mean it's right. It just means it's an average. But in the absence of anything else, at least we thought if we get somewhere around that, it suggests we aren't way off beam. So the next bit of the paper sort of shows the averages nationally for the various factors, which I'm not going to go through each one because there's quite a few. Some of them are not dramatically different to what we'd already been doing. So, for example, the ARPU tends to be around about 3% nationally. Well, that's sort of what we've got, not too dissimilar, 2 or 3%. Deprivation about a third. Again, yeah, that's not too dissimilar. Low power attainment, though, you know, I said that in ours, the primary was about 34%, secondary is 82. Well, one of those is very similar because nationally, it's in terms of the LAs using it, almost all LAs use that. So there's some similarities between what we do and the bottom lines again. So locally, currently, it's 9.59% for primary, 11.24% for secondary. Nationally, 11.71% for primary, 10.89% for secondary. So the bottom lines aren't massively different, but you'll see that nationally it's been reversed. So we have slightly more of the primary budget deemed as SEND than the secondary. We currently have slightly more of the secondary than the primary. Now, I think you could probably argue the case both ways, to be honest. It just depends how you see it. So if you're making the case for more money in the primary sector, and I'm sort of making this up, but just to show what you can do, you could argue the kids when you enter the school system. So they come into the primary schools with high needs, and primary schools have got to do all the sort of the initial work of getting the kids potentially assessed, sort of working out what's the best way of educating them. Also, we're all into early intervention because that tends to, you know, assist further down the line. So give primary schools more money. Argument for secondary schools is certain types of SEND do tend to increase as you hit the secondary school age. SEMH would be an example of that. So you could argue in terms of the prevalence of need, there's an argument that more money needs to go into the secondary sector. So not to say any of those are right or wrong, but you could make an argument for what we do currently, more money to secondary, or you could make an argument for what happens nationally, which is a bit more money in percentage terms anyway, the factors going to the primary. So in terms of what we're going to do then, we've looked at what's nationally, and we've tried to sort of come up with a sort of simplified version, which isn't sort of too different from the national picture. So what we're proposed to do is a system which has the same percentages in each sector. So for each of the factors, we take the same proportion, so there's no distinction. And that ends up with a figure that's very similar to the national figures, but it does mean that we're talking 11.7% of primary and 10.9% of secondary. Now, this is in pound terms. So it's basically saying if you apply the same percentages to the funding factors, because of differences in the proportions of money allocated via these funding factors based upon different demographics in the two sectors, you end up with a higher percentage of the total budget in primary schools being deemed to be notionally for SEN than the secondary schools. At this point, I should probably pause and just re-emphasise the point. None of what we're doing here is going to alter in any way the amount of money schools get. Okay, so nothing of this will affect how much money primary and secondary schools get in the schools' budgets. All it will do is say how much of that money has a label, if you like, of being for notional SEN is put on it. So it's the label, not the actual amount of money being allocated. This isn't a sort of a funding decision per se, just in case people get concerned about the disparity that we're proposing to put more money into a sector. That's not what we're about. It's about how much is deemed to be for notionally for SEND.
And I think, Tim, that is because we've often unpicked our budgets to try and come up with how much we actually spend on SEN across our schools. So I think this is just gives heads a sort of a view really of this is the amount of money in the pot that is deemed to be special needs, because this all goes back to the history, and I've been around too long, of when we used to just have lump sums, didn't we? We used to have in the old days of statements, children came with a value of money, which was and so it was dead easy. You knew that was the amount of money you had to support your children who had statements. And then when the government forced us to move to this new funding model, that sort of got lost in translation, hasn't it? And And I think now at least you can say, as a head, that's my notional send funding. If I'm not spending it all on send, then somebody's going to maybe ask me a question if I'm going back. I don't know your view, Simon, but if I'm going back to say, you know, I'm really struggling to meet need, it's giving everybody a bit of a ballpark figure to look at, I suppose.
I think you're right. I think the first thing is just to reiterate, it's a benchmark, isn't it? So you can at least benchmark your actual spend against notionally what we're saying you should be spending on special educational needs as a school and as a multi-academy trust as well. But yes, what did happen, you're dead right, is all the money was, if you like, went into school budgets with the intention actually of reducing that need to go forward with education, health and care plans, because now schools have got the money in their budgets in order to put in all the early intervention. What has happened nationally is that, yeah, that money has kind of been you know, put into budgets, and then it's got lost in translation. And actually, there's a lot of demand still for those education, health and care plans, as you know. The other issue I think that links to this is the fair distribution, of pupils around schools as well, because notionally you're expected, aren't you, to take your fair share, if you like, of SEND pupils. And it won't all be the same because people have got different deprivation, different communities that they serve, but that is that is a difficulty, I think, when we've got our notional SEN budgets and we have got those thresholds that differ across our schools as well. But you're dead right, Jill. You know, really, ultimately, what we should be able to do is say that this is your notional SEN budget. These are your SEN pupils that you've got. Does it equate? Does it measure up? The one way that we are doing that is where people feel that they've got more than their fair share at the moment, if you like, and we're using that fair share distribution pot. And that is when we are going to now come back and start to do a bit more of that challenge around the notional SEN budget, which I know Tim's going to go on to, is why we need to make sure that it's very clear in those statements that you get from finance around what it is and what it looks like.
I wonder whether we talked about maybe just showing a mock-up of what they might get next year. I don't know whether you've got one of those that we could maybe just share.
A mock-up of the
notional. Well, we're going to give produce a notional SEN budget sheet. So when you get your budget allocations, there'll be this sheet which shows basically how we've calculated it and the bottom line figure. I think in the past what we've done is we've worked out this, and then we, on the bottom of the sheet or the top, we've put on the EHCP funding as well. So with the idea of trying to express the totality in the school of what we would deem to be high needs funding. And the thing that is striking is that EHCP funding for schools, I haven't got the figures in front of me, but you might be looking at, I don't know, 2 or 3 million maybe tops going in, something like that. Well, the amount of money that we'll be deeming via the notional SEND budget is probably going to be about pushing 15 million, something like that, across the school system. So in other words, the amount of funding that's within mainstream school budgets far exceeds the amount of funding that comes in specifically for high needs. And as Jill's alluded to, some of that is because the first 15 hours of EHCPs, you don't get any extra funding for. It's all deemed to be in your school budget to start with. So in a sense, there's a danger by not emphasising the notional budget. We sort of, everyone sort of half forgets the fact that the vast bulk of high needs funding in mainstream schools is actually already in your main budget.
Yeah, but I think, you know, and I've had that argument with Simon and the Senti, but I mean, for example, HLC, when we went to this new formula, because we had so many children on statements, we lost about £200,000 or £300,000 on the switchover because we had a disproportionate number of children on statements. So it is about trying to level this up a bit again.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the conversations hand in hand, really, around the kind of fairer distribution of pupils. Absolutely, and also I just want to emphasise that we recognise that schools are putting in a lot of support for their pupils with SEND as well. So please don't feel, and I hope you don't, that this is about us saying, oh, wait a minute, schools, you've got all this money, come on, use it, because we don't think that. It's just about making sure that it's more transparent and that you're able, as we said before, to use it as a benchmark, and it helps with the conversation. Yeah.
Andy, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I can quickly share that with you now, and it will have to be quickly because we shouldn't be putting stuff up on screen. So I'll quickly put this up for you. you can have a look at what a statement would look like. Okay, can you see that? Okay.
Yeah, it's just come up,
Yeah.
Andy. Right.
Okay, so part of this will look familiar to you because we used to send national budgets out before. Effectively, this would show the number of EHCPs you would have, and you get that from the send team around February each year as a Word document. So this breaks it down into numbers for you. It gives you some notes upon how all of these numbers are made. Then on the second sheet, which probably isn't as familiar, because this basically shows what Tim's actually had in his paper and gives you some kind of numbers. Now, this is for a large secondary school. That kind of effectively.
And you see it combines the two allocations there. So the
Yeah.
first sheet is the 83,936, and then the second sheet is the 574.
Yeah.
But as we said, that's probably not untypical in that the notional budget will be far in excess of the high needs block funding, which otherwise there's a temptation to be seen as that's what schools have got to pay for high needs. Well, it's far more than that.
So effectively, that's what you're saying is within the schools block. Based upon the allocations that we put in the APT for the financial year 2021-2022, and you've got notes down there basically saying how we've come up with the figures. So I can email that all out to the members here if you'd like.
That'd be helpful, I think, because if we're talking to our groups that we represent, then I think, as we said when we were talking before the meeting, it's just useful for a member to actually be able to talk other heads through this. But I think we also said, Tim, that I think this is going to need to be explained to the heads at primary heads and secondary heads in due course, because there'll be a lot of heads who don't understand the history of this and how the original formula was derived and why it's happening. So I think there's they're going to need a bit of support to get their heads.
Yeah, I agree, Jill. And I think as well, we need to make sure we've got it all in the round because, yes, they've got the notional budget we just talked about. We've talked about budget, the funding for education, health and care plans. We've also got funding for the Inclusive School Forum, which now makes up quite a huge amount of money that we're pumping in before an education, health and care plan. And then, as I say, we've got the exceptional funding bid process for the fair distribution. So all of those four elements need to be understood in order to explain how we meet need going forward. The other caveat in all of this is part of the SEND review, I think, has recognised some of the issues that we've talked about notional SEN budgets becoming a bit fuzzy, and whether or not there needs to be a review of that as well. So, like everything, there's lots of conversations going on around SEND. We don't know when that national review's coming out. It's been delayed again. So,
but I think heads need,
the here and now,
they need the here and now, and they need that paper which demonstrates this is how it's going to be in you're going to see it, but also these are, like you say, the inclusive school money and all the other pots of money that are now available for heads to bid into or whatever. So, and aren't you looking also to, maybe it's later in the paper, but you're looking at the funding being similar for EHCP in mainstream as it is in.
Yeah, it's not in the paper, but we are looking at a unified banding system.
Unified banding,
and I think how exactly we do that, we're still, we'll seem to work it out. But I think it is looking almost certain that we would be putting, for example, more money into funding EHCPs in mainstream schools, because we haven't really looked at that funding for a while. But we want to try and create some sort of consistency, following the sort of idea of sort of transparency, consistency, really. So rather than having all these little bits which don't really seem to mesh together. So as Simon says, we can sort of articulate the whole system and how it all fits together and how, the rationale for why we are doing it the way we're doing it.
And to confirm, when we do that review of the banded funding system, we are absolutely not looking at reducing any budgets whatsoever. And actually, we do need to make sure we're pumping more money into mainstream. It won't be just the HCs; it'll be the Inclusive School Forum as well. So to make sure that it all makes sense. Yeah.
I think that's very welcome, but I also think that banding being the same means also for parents understanding that the funding, they wouldn't get any more funding going into a special school. So
Yep.
it might, again, it alleviates a bit of the pressure and parents thinking they need special. So I think it will help those conversations as well.
Definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, Tim, to interrupt you in mid-flow.
No, not at all. No, that's great. Very useful. I wanted to ask the 4 members on this, because we talked about the theory of this as well, and hopefully sort of you're clear about sort of what the national SEND budget is about. And I said we have gone about it by looking at the national picture and trying to sort of align ourselves, broadly speaking, with the sort of the average is what other authorities do. But it's whether anyone's got any sort of views on the factors that we've used to build this up and the proportions of each factor that we've used. And again, I don't necessarily want to go through them in great detail, but for example, we're saying that 40% of deprivation funding we're going to deem as being notionally for SEND, 80% of low power attainment funding notionally for SEND. So those are 2 big ones. Does anyone have any views on that in terms of whether it sounds about right, sounds completely off the wall?
Any thoughts?
I think it sounds reasonable without going into great depth. I don't know how else you could go about it at this point, to be honest. And I think this will be helpful for schools to start thinking about how much SEND money is in their budgets already, because I think it's got lost in the overall system.
I mean, it's perhaps just worth sort of saying, you know, without the simple percentages, what is the board sort of thinking about this? Well, in terms of things like the AWPU and the lump sum, the proposition is that in any school of any demographics, there's going to be a certain amount of high needs. So there's some high needs that is just in the general population. There's no particular link to deprivation or low power attainment. It's just there's always going to be a certain amount in any school's budget. So we do take some of the general funding factors, albeit a small proportion. On the other side of the scale, low power attainment, the sort of assumption is there's a very strong link there to SEND. So we're assuming the majority of that can be deemed to be SEND. Deprivation, it's much lower than low power attainment, but the underlying assumption there is quite a lot of SEND is quite strongly associated with deprivation. Not all of it, but quite a lot of it. So we end up 40% there. So that's just the broad rationale. Other ones which you might think are less obvious, EAL, we're saying 20%. I mean, again, I suppose you can argue that both ways. The DFE doesn't use EAL as part of their funding formula to dish out SEND to us. But you could argue that kids with the EAL, in terms of the backgrounds, maybe in some circles more problematic, that might be associated with it. They've clearly got the difficulties of EAL in terms of just settling into school with all the associated issues that might bring. I mean, we're taking 20% of that. Again, it seems to me perfectly reasonable to argue that both ways. And then we're taking some of the minimum per pupil funding and minimum funding guarantee. So this, in effect, the minimum per pupil funding, as we said earlier, is bringing all schools up to minimum level. We've deemed 25% of that as being for notional SEND. Rationale, we think, for that is that why is it reasonable to give schools some additional funding if the funding formula per se doesn't take them to this level? Well, you would assume that somewhere in the rationale is the sense that, well, every school does have some additional needs, and if you just fund them on the sort of the demographic of the school, they may find it difficult to actually deliver the basic sort of education with the additional needs running alongside. Therefore, some of that extra money, one would assume, is meeting these additional needs costs in schools. Similarly for minimum funding guarantee, again, we put 10% of that in. I suppose the assumption for that is, well, if we're deeming 10 or 11% of school budgets is for notional SEND across the picture, it doesn't seem unreasonable to assume that the MFG protection will be 10% of that would be for SEND. So I'll just say that's because the rationale for all these may not immediately be obvious to you. So that's broadly speaking what it is. And again, it's whether anyone's got any strong views that we should be doing something differently.
Any views? Because we discussed, didn't we, the EAL factor, whether, you know, that should be in the school, didn't we? And we decided that probably it should be at the moment. I think what will happen here is schools will look at these statements when they come out, and then they'll do a piece of work around, you know, what does my TA workforce, what workforce do I employ, and resources, and do the two things equate. Do you see what I mean? If they're wildly different, and every school says they're wildly different, then I think you've got to go back to the formula, haven't you?
Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah. Agreed.
Because until we test it, we can't really comment. So it may be something Schools Forum's got to just be thinking about over the next, you know, couple of years. Because I'd certainly look at this and say, right, I know how much I spend on SEND in this school, in my schools. So does that look about right when I run my costs?
I'm conscious it's a very abstract paper at the moment.
It is very
most people find it very difficult to form a view on these abstracts when it translates into the reality of running a school. And then you know, tons of pound signs, and we're saying you've got £500,000, and you're saying I've totted up what I think I spend, and it comes to £750,000. That's when you start thinking, oh, that can't be quite right. And at that point, I think everyone gets a bit more engaged and can relate to the discussion a bit more. So I do agree with what you're saying, Jill. It's a bit of we do this, people then have a look at it, and then we discuss whether it does feel about right.
Yeah, and I think heads, when you present all this, they need to maybe, you know, supported to look at that modelling a little bit. You know, not everybody, you know, spends their life looking at these sorts of figures, but you know, it's all about your curriculum plan as well, Simon, isn't it? It's very much, you know, your school organisation to meet the profile of and the cohort of children that come through the door. So, you know, I'd say I employ an additional English teacher because I have huge issues with low prior attainment in English. So, yeah, it's those sorts of that bit of modelling that I think schools need to be looking at, and then we can sort of review it, can't we?
Sounds like we need some some workshops, don't we? You know, not lengthy ones, but
I think heads will do what Jill said. When we get it, it'll start us thinking, and
so present this, and then
and then you'll get some feedback.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, for me, I thought the EAL one was the only one that I had a question mark on as well, because EAL and SEND are not necessarily hand in hand and shouldn't be necessarily hand in hand. However, I do know the previous formula it was a 50% chunk, and we reduced it to 20% chunk. So, you know, you could debate all of these things. Ultimately, we need something, don't we? And a framework, and we need to try it. Yeah.
And it's a good starter for 10. It just gets people thinking about it, and then people may look at it and go, maybe I'm not spending enough of my budget on SEND. You never know. I'm not sure many. Sorry, Christopher.
I think it'll just make people realise there is money in their budget. Because we tend to think, don't you, when you've got SEN, we need funding. You don't think about what's in your budget.
Was it 2012 when all this happened? I've got to dust off all of my old training stuff and bring it back out, because, you know, what we had to do was lots and lots of conversations to really emphasize that block of money that now sits within your budgets. But yeah, of course, over the years, it's got lost.
You've got loads of heads who've come in since then who will have no idea, and I think having it on our budgets will be quite useful.
Okay, Tim, anything more to say on this paper?
No, I appreciate the feedback. That's great, and I do take the point that we sort of have to go with this or something similar, and then we'll see how it feels like out there in the real world when you've got pound signs on a piece of paper and you look at what you do in the school, and then you see how you form a view on it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Tim. Any more questions to Tim on his paper? Okay, fantastic. Right, well, we're hurtling through the agenda. So I think we are now on any other business. I don't have any other business to report. I don't think I have, Tim, have I? Tim, have you got anything?
I don't think so. Just to, I think, reiterate what you said at the start, Jill, that if you look at the agenda, 4 members will see at the moment, we are assuming that the next meeting will be at Meeting Point House.
Yeah.
And we will make sure we emphasise that in advance of the meeting. I mean, all this is with the proviso, of course, that it depends upon what's happening with the COVID and the pandemic. You know, if we enter into a more restricted sort of environment, obviously we might look again. but at the moment, we are assuming it'll be a meeting in person at Meeting Point House. And I say that because obviously it's quite a while since we've done that. So quite I would understand if people, easy to forget and just log on and then find, so if
we're not online. And remind us of the date, Andy. Is that 17th November or am I?
The next
18th.
one is 18th of November, Thursday.
Oh, sorry, it's at the bottom page. Yeah, 18th of November, Meeting Point House. So that's what we're going to do unless things change. That will be the face-to-face one. Okay, have we got Simon? Have you got anything else?
No, I haven't got anything else at this point. Thanks.
Andy?
Yeah, I think what we should have done at the beginning was record thanks to those forum members that have left us.
Yes. Yes.
So we got Mark Davis and Denise Garner off the top of my head, that have been members for quite a while. So yeah. Could
we record that in a minute then, Andy, please? Our thanks to those forum members for their contributions.
Apologies, Jill. I've now got something after that. After Andy's just prompted me in terms of attendance and making sure that we get as much attendance as possible. Is there anything else that we need to do to encourage? Because I'm just aware, I know we've had a lot of apologies today and understand because it's right at the beginning of the year, but clearly there's some big decisions that need to be made November and January time. So yeah, is there anything more that we can do in order to encourage attendance? Do you want us to send out individual emails or?
I think just a meeting invite to all forum members so it goes straight into Outlook calendars, because I think sometimes people don't, they remember that they see the dates, they come round, but I always make sure they're in my calendar.
Are they not necessarily in the calendar? Okay, yep.
Yeah, so maybe an Outlook meeting invite and then it just goes straight into people's calendars and then other things don't get put in.
Yeah. Okay, and as I say, if we do that briefing for the notice board and we can get a bit of traction there, yeah, okay.
But I think perhaps under AOB, Andy, it is, forum does recommend that members attend. It's really important. They do represent heads, and there are important decisions looming, and we don't want the heads to feel they're not being consulted when they need to be consulted. So
just one example. Yeah, sorry, Jill. Just one example, I guess, was when we had that early years discussion, and I felt, I haven't quite got the right representation in the room to know if we've totally signed this off. And then I'm doing a lot of kind of work behind the scenes, so it does help if we can just recommend that all members attend, not appreciating that everyone's really, really busy. I know that, but it does help. Yeah.
And I think we're getting papers out, early enough for people to have had a good look at. I do think that's important that we do get, and we have a pre-meeting so that I know what we're talking about. That works well. So I think, unless anybody tells me otherwise, I think the mechanism is okay. But we do need people to attend if at all possible.
Yeah, I've put my hand up. We do publicise meetings. We try and get them out, the dates out 2 years in advance, or up to 2 years in advance. Having said that, we've just moved back next September's meeting by 2 weeks. So we have got a little bit more time to get the papers out early, because I think we only got them out on Monday this time, which isn't probably early enough.
Yeah.
But yeah, we can get those invites into people's diaries. The problem is that sometimes if membership changes, they do drop out. But yeah, we can give it a go. I mean, at least people then have got something.
Yeah, I think it just helps. And I agree. Yeah, this one's probably quite soon. We're only really in the second week back, and we've come back.
Are we?
Yeah, I know. But we've come back to yet another set of challenges which are abnormal. And taking up. I know
that's it. Yeah, exactly.
Dealing with the pandemic still. And there's been all the testing going on, and God, it's been manic. Okay, so anybody else? Anything they'd like to raise under any other business? Okay, fantastic. You've done really well, guys. 20 to 11. So we won't take up any more of your precious time. Thank you for your contributions, your attendance. Thank you to Tim and Andy for putting the papers out and making it very clear to us what we're talking about. And I look forward to seeing you soon. Have
Great.
a good few
Thanks,
weeks.
Jill.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.